He served in the mountains for most of his life. But one steel door, hidden under a landslide, changed everything. The ranger saw how silent the forest was, but he didn't know what had already come out. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The forest had a way of speaking to Harold Mason, though never in words. It spoke in wind, in the rustle of pine needles across the frozen ground, in the calls of distant hawks that glided above him like sentinels guarding the mountains. After 40 years in these woods, Harold understood the language of silence better than most men understood spoken sentences. And in recent weeks, the silence had changed. It had thickened, deepened, taken on an edge that made him pause in the middle of a trail and listen with a tension he hadn't felt since his early days as a ranger. But he told himself it was age, the way it sharpened certain senses while dulling others. That was easier to believe than the idea that something was wrong with the woods he called home. Harold's cabin sat at the boundary where forest met sky, perched on a ridge that held morning mist like a bowl. The cabin was plain, assembled from timber he had cut himself years ago, with a slanted roof that creaked when mountain winds pressed against it. The inside smelled of pine resin and coffee grounds. Every corner bore the mark of his hands-patched boards, old nails hammered straight and reused, shelves he carved during long winters when storms kept him from flying or riding out into the woods. He lived alone and preferred it that way. Solitude had become a comfort in the same way old boots shape themselves to a man's feet. When he was away from it, something felt wrong. He was a large man still, though age had begun carving at him quietly. His hair, once thick and dark, now held more gray than color, and the lines at the corners of his eyes deepened each time he squinted into the sun from the cockpit of his aircraft. His knees complained when he climbed slopes, and his lower back held a stubborn ache that no stretches or hot compresses could fully ease. Still, he moved with a slow, careful strength, the kind built from decades of hauling gear, clearing fallen logs, and hiking miles across unforgiving terrain. He had never married, never had children. The forest had taken the place of both companionship and responsibility. It had shaped him, steadied him, and in many ways become the only thing in his life he could fully trust. The one exception had been Robert Nash. Robert had been his partner for 8 years, sharp-minded, reckless at times, but with a steady moral compass. They had worked together until that day, nearly 3 decades ago when Robert vanished somewhere in the northern sector. It had been called an accident, a misstep, a fall into one of the deep ravines. Search teams scoured the area for days and weeks. Helicopter crews combed the slopes, and dogs followed fading trails until the scent disappeared entirely. No body had been recovered, no trace of clothing, no sign of equipment. Only Harold's memory of the last time he saw his friend alive, walking ahead on a trail that dipped toward the deeper parts of the forest. After that, the woods swallowed him whole. Harold kept Robert's old badge inside a drawer next to his bed. He didn't open that drawer often. When he did, he stared at the worn nameplate, letting the weight of the past press into him before closing it again. The years did not dull the feeling. If anything, they sharpened it. His Ranger Scout 3 aircraft was the only thing that brought him comfort in recent weeks. The small single-seater had been built long before modern light aircraft became sleek composite machines. This one was all metal and rivets, scratched and weather-beaten, but loyal. He had replaced its engine twice and rewired its radio system himself. The cockpit smelled faintly of oil and sun-faded leather. The seat cushion had molded itself to his shape over years of flying low across the forest to survey damaged trails, search for lost hikers, or simply remind himself that the sky could still carry him when the ground felt too heavy. That morning, As he prepared for the day's routine flight check, the forest gave him another silent signal, one that felt more like a warning than a greeting. The cold air seemed thicker, the quiet more absolute. He checked the temperature, expecting a drop, but it was nearly normal for early winter. Yet something was wrong. He felt it in the way the hairs on his arms rose when he stepped outside, in the way his breath lingered longer than usual in the morning air. The northern sector had been bothering him for nearly a month. Animal activity had diminished so drastically there that Harold found it unsettling. Tracks that once painted the mud with patterns, deer, elk, wolves, even the nearly invisible steps of foxes, had vanished. Birds no longer flew over that section of the forest. Their calls stopped abruptly at an invisible line, as if something kept them from crossing. Harold could find no reason for it. No wildfire scars, no new predators, no human interference, just emptiness. The previous night he had stood outside his cabin with a lantern in hand, listening. The forest had been still, but not the peaceful kind of stillness he knew well. This stillness felt forced, like a held breath. Then, faintly, as though beneath the earth itself, he heard a low metallic hum. Not a generator, not any machine he recognized. It pulsed at intervals, a mechanical heartbeat somewhere deep below the soil. He listened for nearly an hour as the sound grew softer, then vanished entirely. He slept poorly afterward. At sunrise, he strapped on his boots, pulled his jacket tight, and walked out to the small clearing where his plane rested under a canvas cover. Frost had settled along the wings in delicate crystals. As he removed the cover and checked the fuel lines, he tried to shake the thought that the forest was changing in ways he didn't understand. Maybe it was the season. Maybe it was time. But no matter how he justified it, the unease stayed with him. He took off smoothly, the little plane rising with a familiar whir of propellers, cutting through the thin mountain air. The forest beneath stretched vast and shadowed, its trees packed tightly together like soldiers in formation. He flew toward the northern sector, watching for any signs that might explain the unusual silence. Nothing moved below. No animals dashed through the underbrush. No birds rose startled at his passing. It was as if he were flying over a painting, a still life where every motion had been erased. Then the radio crackled. At first Harold thought it was static, just interference from the mountains. But the noise sharpened, forming a faint sound, something like a broken transmission. He turned the dial slightly, listening. The radio hissed, then another sound came through, a distorted combination of tones and fragmented syllables, a voice without shape or intention. Unit, Cycle, 4. The words faded before he could grasp them. He frowned, adjusting the frequency. The Ranger Scout 3 still used an old analog system. Interference wasn't unusual. But this didn't feel like interference. It felt like someone trying to speak on a forgotten channel. After a moment, the radio fell silent again. He flew lower, following the edge of the northern ridge. The ground below showed no signs of disturbance at first, but as he traced the path of the old logging road, something caught his eye. A section of earth looked freshly displaced. The soil shifted into uneven ridges. He circled once more at a lower altitude, and then he saw it clearly. A large patch of land had collapsed in what looked like a recent landslide. Harold landed near the ridge, the wheels crunching lightly on hard ground. He stepped out, grabbed his walking stick, and made his way toward the disturbed area. The air grew colder as he approached, unnaturally cold for this part of the forest. Mist curled low to the ground. The scent of wet earth mingled with something metallic. The landslide had peeled back layers of soil like torn fabric. Rocks lay scattered in jagged heaps. He moved closer, his boots sinking into the soft earth. Then, just beyond a curtain of uprooted roots, he saw something he had never seen in his decades as a ranger, Embedded in the exposed cliffside was a massive steel door. It rose taller than he was, and twice as wide, a solid slab of metal framed by thick riveted borders. Rust coated its surface in dark streaks, but beneath the decay, Harold sensed strength, a cold resilience that had endured long before he was born. Across the center hung a faded sign, the letters barely readable through decades of weathering. Danger. Keep out. He stood frozen. This door didn't belong here. Nothing in the records, nothing in old maps, nothing in ranger archives mentioned any structure in these mountains. No Cold War bunker, no abandoned mine entrance reinforced with steel. And even if something like that had existed, someone would have told him. He had been here too long, served too faithfully for there to be secrets buried beneath his feet. But here it was, a door that looked older than the cabin he lived in, older than many of the roads he patrolled, older, maybe, than the station itself. He approached cautiously, each step sending a crunch through the debris. The forest felt wrong around him, too quiet, as though sound itself had retreated. No birds, no wind. Even the branches of the trees seemed still. He reached out and placed his gloved hand on the door. It was freezing cold. Colder than the winter air. Colder than the shaded rocks. A deep, unnatural cold that seeped through the leather and into his skin. He stepped back and tried to take a picture. His phone refused to activate the camera. He tried again. The screen went black. He pulled out his old digital camera, an ancient piece of equipment he used out of stubborn loyalty, and pressed the shutter. The camera flickered, beeped, and shut off. He turned it over, checked the battery, shook it slightly. Nothing. He muttered under his breath and pulled away. Even his wristwatch was behaving strangely. Its hands had stopped for nearly a minute before jolting forward again. He didn't know what disturbed him more, the door or the way everything around it reacted. With a tightening in his chest, he walked back to the plane. Once in the cockpit, he radioed headquarters. His voice was steady, but his fingers trembled. "Base, this is Mason. I've discovered a structure in Sector 9. You should see it yourself. It looks old. Some sort of reinforced door, coordinates transmitting." Silence filled the cockpit for a long moment. Then a voice answered. It was the duty officer, one Harold knew well. But the tone was wrong sharp, too quick, as though the man had been waiting for this exact message. "Mason, you are to leave the area immediately." Harold blinked. "Repeat, Base. Did you say, leave the area? Do not approach the structure again. Do not take photographs. Do not disturb anything. Sector 9 is closed. Do you understand?" The abruptness of it struck him like a physical blow. In decades of storm seasons, lost hikers, poachers, and wildfire threats, he had never received an order like that. "What is that door?" Harold pressed. "Mason, I said pull out. Return to station and file a report. End of transmission." The radio clicked dead. He sat motionless for a long time. The plane hummed softly beneath him. His heart beat slow and heavy. The words echoed in his skull, not because they frightened him, but because they sounded like a lie. Harold had lived long enough to recognize when someone hid the truth, and the truth was being buried deeper than the door in the hillside. He flew home in uneasy silence, thinking of the coldness of the metal, the empty forest, the sign that seemed to whisper warnings even after he left. When he landed, the sun had already dipped behind the mountains. That night, the cabin felt different. He lit a fire in the stove, though the air wasn't cold enough to require one, and sat at his table flipping through his old logs. Nothing he had ever encountered matched what he'd seen today. He tried to read, tried to distract himself, but the memory of that steel door intruded constantly, breaking his concentration. Then, near midnight, his radio crackled. He jumped. The radio sat on the far counter, unused except during emergencies. It hissed, then shifted into a strange, broken sound, like someone breathing through static. Harold stood, heart tight in his chest, and approached it. Slowly, he lifted the receiver. "Base?" he said quietly. The static changed. A faint voice emerged, shaky and thin. "Harold!" His breath caught. "Don't go. Don't." "Door. Stay away." The voice faded, then strengthened again. "Harold! Listen!" He knew that voice. "Robert!" Silence pulsed on the line. Then, "Don't! Open! The door!" And the radio died. Harold stood frozen, the receiver still pressed against his ear. His hands shook, his throat tightened. For a moment he thought he might collapse under the weight of recognition. He stared at the silent radio, waiting, hoping for another word, but nothing came. Outside, something cracked a branch. The forest exhaled a long, slow breath, and Harold Mason knew that the world he thought he understood had just shifted into something darker, deeper, and far more dangerous than anything he had faced in his lifetime. Morning arrived without the comfort of light. A dense curtain of fog hung over the ridge, swallowing the outlines of trees until they became nothing more than gray silhouettes. Harold Mason stepped onto the porch of his cabin with the same unease he had gone to sleep with, though he doubted he had slept more than an hour. The voice from the radio lingered in his mind, replaying itself in fragments that made his skin crawl each time he recalled them. Robert's voice, older, ragged, distorted by static, yet unmistakably his. After 29 years of silence, it had returned like a ghost that refused to stay buried. Harold rubbed his hands together, not because of the cold, but because he felt restless in a way that bordered on agitation. The forest felt as if it were holding something in suspension. Even the fog didn't drift with its usual slow elegance. It clung immobile, frozen in the air as if waiting. He forced himself to breathe slowly. He needed to go back to the northern ridge. He knew it before he even admitted it aloud. That door, whatever it was, had not revealed all it hid. And after the message last night, he doubted it had finished revealing anything. He made coffee out of habit, but the taste felt distant, as though he couldn't fully register it. His mind was already at the ridge, measuring the distance, calculating flight time, imagining what might have happened during the night. He tried to tell himself that returning to the door went against orders, that the sensible thing would be to file the report and leave the matter to the government. But he knew better. The government didn't want anyone near the door. That alone was enough to drive Harold back to it. Nothing in the years he had served had ever been hidden from him so directly. The secrecy burned in his chest like a dare. He walked out to the clearing and uncovered the Ranger Scout 3. Frost coated its metal skin. The tiny aircraft looked fragile against the vastness of the mountains, yet Harold trusted it as he trusted nothing else. It was a living thing in his eyes, temperamental but loyal, protective in the way an old dog is protective simply by sitting beside you. He brushed the frost from the windshield, checked the oil, inspected the fuel valve, and ran his hand along the wing. Everything looked sound. As he climbed into the cockpit, the fog swirled as though disturbed by an invisible force. He ignored the prickling sensation creeping up the back of his neck and started the engine. It sputtered at first, then roared to life. The familiar vibration spread through the frame. He throttled forward and guided the plane into the fog-muted sky. The northern sector rose beneath him in a labyrinth of subdued grays and ghostly shadows. The forest had never looked so still. No deer darted across the clearings. No hawks circled overhead. The absence of movement pressed on Harold with a heavy weight. He had flown over these woods thousands of times, but this view, the stillness, the lifeless quiet felt wrong in a way that made his heart beat faster. As he approached the ridge where he had discovered the door, the fog thickened, clinging to the treetops like wool. He circled twice, looking for the clearing created by the landslide. It took him a moment to see it, partially hidden beneath a fresh veil of fog. But it was there. Not only was it there, but something about it had changed. The ground around the exposed cliffside had sunk further. What had been an uneven depression yesterday was now a deeper sag, as though the earth had settled overnight. The disturbed soil appeared freshly shifted, despite no rain falling since the previous day. Something had moved beneath the ground, pushing from below. Harold brought the plane down a short distance away and cut the engine. As soon as the propeller slowed to a stop, he felt the strange cold in the air again. Not winter cold, something sharper, metallic, alien. He stepped out carefully, grabbed his stick, and made his way toward the slope. The fog thinned the closer he got, as though the air resisted allowing the door to be seen. But eventually it gave way, and the dark shape of the steel slab emerged from the gray. Harold stopped several feet away, his heart quickening. The door looked different. It wasn't open, not exactly, but it leaned slightly outward, not flush against the stone as it had before. A gap no wider than the width of a thumb ran along its right edge, just enough to show darkness where solid rock should have been. Harold felt a chill run up his spine. Something had pushed against it. Something had tried to come out. He crouched, examining the ground. What he saw made his breath hitch. The dirt directly in front of the door had been disturbed, not by wind or erosion, but by movement. Deliberate movement. There were marks, long, shallow grooves that ran in 3 staggered segments, as if something with elongated limbs or an uneven gait had dragged itself forward. The prints were not deep, but they were unmistakable. Harold traced the edges of one groove with trembling fingers. It was too wide for a human hand, too long for a bear's paw, too narrow for any hoof he'd ever seen. It felt wrong. The shape itself felt wrong, like something born in a place where no creature should have been born. The 2 trees closest to the landslide large firs that had stood straight and healthy only yesterday now looked skeletal. Their needles had fallen away entirely, scattered in brown heaps around the roots. The bark had cracked and peeled, exposing pale wood beneath. He touched one trunk. It crumbled under his fingers as if rotten. Yet these trees had been alive, vibrant, thriving for decades. Trees do not decay overnight. The metallic smell clung to the air more strongly here, mixing with something faintly chemical, something Harold couldn't identify. It reminded him distantly of old refrigeration units, the kind used in abandoned industrial sites. Cold air with a taste of rust. He approached the door slowly, lifting his hand toward the metal. Before touching it, he hesitated. A lifetime of instinct warned him not to, but he forced himself to make contact. The metal was ice, not cold like winter stone, not cold like metal left overnight in frost. This cold was unnatural, stinging through the glove so sharply that Harold pulled his hand away with a hiss. Frost formed along the seams in the instant after he touched it. He looked at his glove. The leather had stiffened. Then he leaned forward and pressed his ear against the metal. The echo that came through was faint, but undeniable. A hollow space lay behind that door. A massive, cavernous space. A space that had been sealed for a very long time. He stepped back, shaking out his numb fingers. He had brought tools in the plane, nothing meant for forced entry, but enough to test the door's structural integrity. He retrieved a small pry bar and wedged it against the edge of the slab. He did not intend to open it, just to feel if it moved, if it resisted. As he applied the slightest pressure, the door shifted, not forward, not backward, but with a vibration. A shiver ran through the steel, as though something on the other side had answered the touch. Harold froze. The vibration stopped as quickly as it started. The silence afterward felt heavier. He stood still for a long minute, listening. His breath formed clouds in front of his face. No sound came from behind the door, but the grooves in the soil told him that silence meant nothing. He scanned the area again. That's when he noticed something past the collapsed earth, half buried under roots and mud. A shape. He approached cautiously, pushing aside a cluster of broken branches. What emerged brought the sting of memory. A flashlight. Old, metal. Scratched, the kind issued to rangers nearly 30 years ago. He lifted it, brushing dirt from its surface. The switch was rusted, the lens cracked. But Harold knew this model. He had used one just like it during his early years with the service. Next to the flashlight lay something else, a dented metal canteen, stamped faintly with the initials USFS United States Forest Service. He picked it up, feeling the weight of rust inside. As he turned it over, something caught on his glove, a torn scrap of fabric. He lifted it into the light. The color was so faded, it was nearly unrecognizable, but the stitching remained. A small name patch, frayed around the edges. Nash. Harold dropped to his knees before he realized what he was doing. The world collapsed inward around him. The fog, the trees, the cold metal door all blurred. He felt the earth beneath his palms and breathed unevenly. He told himself it could be coincidence, that old equipment scattered the forest all the time. But he knew better. He felt it deep in his chest. Robert had been here, not before he disappeared, but before he died. Because Harold knew whatever had happened to Robert, it hadn't been a fall or an accident. He had been here, at this door, at this impossible steel barrier buried in a mountain that should have held only soil and stone. Harold gathered the flashlight, the canteen, the fabric scrap, and carried them back to the plane with slow, mechanical steps. He stored them carefully in his pack, then sat in the cockpit, staring at nothing until his breath slowed enough to throttle up. He flew home without remembering the flight at all. The fog clung to him when he landed. The moment he stepped inside the cabin, a deep unease pressed against his ribs. He wanted to call someone, anyone, but couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he laid the items on the table and stared at them as the daylight faded away. He kept listening for the radio, though it remained silent throughout the evening. At dusk, he heard the first sound, a heavy thump outside the cabin. Not a deer, not a bear. Something heavier, slower, dragging its weight deliberately. Harold extinguished the lantern and stood still in the darkness. His heartbeat thudded in his throat. Something moved just beyond the logs of the exterior wall. The wood creaked. Harold felt the vibration through the floorboards. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the presence retreated. The forest swallowed the sound. He waited an hour before he dared to breathe normally again. Then the radio crackled. He turned toward it slowly, each step feeling as though it carried him toward a memory he didn't want to see again. The radio hissed, then split into that same broken whisper. "Harold!" His blood ran cold. Close. The door. The static thickened. Then a voice, hoarse and wet with dread. "They're coming!" The final word stretched, warped by fear, swallowed by static until only a faint crackle remained. Harold stood frozen in the dark, the voice echoing through his skull long after the transmission died. He didn't move for a long time. His legs felt anchored to the floor. When he finally stepped outside onto the porch, the fog parted just enough for him to see a silhouette far among the trees. Tall, motionless, watching. The shape did not sway or breathe or shift. It simply stood, as though carved from the fog itself. Harold closed the door softly and slid the bolt into place. In the heavy silence, the forest exhaled around him again, and he understood perhaps for the first time, that the door on the ridge had never been meant to be opened, but something behind it had tried to open it anyway. The night stretched long and sleepless, and Harold Mason knew that when dawn came, the woods would not forgive hesitation. Tomorrow he would have to return, but this time not to observe. This time to follow the trail of whatever had forced its way out. Morning came not as light, but as a thinning of the night. The fog had not lifted, it had thickened, becoming a gray wall that obscured even the closest trees. Harold Mason rose from his bed with the weight of a man already halfway inside a nightmare. His muscles ached, not from labor, but from dread that had settled deep into the bone. The voice from the radio still pulsed in his ears, the strained whisper of Robert Nash, a man who should have been dead nearly 3 decades, and the silhouette he had seen outside his cabin, standing motionless between the trunks, refusing to sway with the wind, refusing even to breathe. He knew that image would follow him into the grave. The cabin felt smaller this morning, as though the fog itself pressed against the walls. Harold strapped on his boots, checked his pistol, though he doubted it would matter, and slung his pack over his shoulder. He paused in the doorway, listening for movement, for breath, for any sign that what had visited him last night remained. The forest held its silence close, offering no reassurance. He stepped outside, boots crunching on brittle frost. The fog licked around him like cold smoke. He scanned the tree line but saw nothing except the vague, shuddering shapes of branches. Yet he felt watched. He felt it the way a man feels the approach of a storm. Deep in the skin, deep in the skull. His plane waited in the clearing, a small metal island in a sea of white. The Ranger Scout 3 had never looked so vulnerable, its wings pale against the indistinct morning. As Harold approached, he noticed a scattering of needles and broken twigs atop the tail, as if something had perched there. He ran his hand along the metal cold as ever, but the surface felt faintly damp, as though touched by breath. He shook off the feeling and climbed into the cockpit. The engine came alive reluctantly, coughing once before settling into a steady hum. Harold tugged the headphones over his ears and listened with dread to the static. No voice came through. For now, he lifted the plane off the ground and climbed through the fog, which closed behind him like a lid sealing shut. He navigated by instinct more than sight, following the faint darkening where the ridge should be. The northern sector loomed beneath him, a jagged shadow in the gray. The trees were still lifeless. Even the fog felt different here, heavier, as if saturated with something invisible and old. Harold found the clearing after circling twice. The depression in the earth had grown again. What had been a shallow sag before was now a measurable sink, deeper, more pronounced, as though the ground were loosening from beneath. He landed nearby, stepping out into the thickening silence. The air had changed. It tasted metallic, as if infused with particles that didn't belong to the surface world. The smell carried a faint undercurrent of cold machinery. Old machinery, the kind left to run far beyond its intended lifespan. He approached the door with reluctance, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. The steel slab loomed larger than yesterday. Frost clung to its surface in elaborate patterns, spirals and web-like lines, as though drawn by a hand in the night. The gap along the right side had widened, enough now that he could see darkness past the seam, not shadow from the surface, but true darkness. A depth of black that did not reflect the dim morning light. Harold stepped closer, breath coming slow and unsteady. He traced the edge with his gloved fingers, feeling the unnatural cold radiating outward. As he knelt to examine the widened gap, a deep rumble reverberated beneath the soil. The ground trembled under him, not violently, but unmistakably. A pulse, like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. He staggered back, stomach lurching. The vibration continued a moment longer, then faded into silence that somehow felt even heavier. He exhaled only when it was gone. Then, slowly, he pressed both hands against the cold slab. The metal was unyielding until it wasn't. A long, low groan rolled through the air as the door shifted inward by a fraction. A breath of air escaped from the darkness, brushing his skin with a cold so profound it seemed impossible. It smelled of stone, rust, and something faintly organic. Something alive. Harold stepped back quickly, heart pounding. He considered retreating, considered starting the plane, and leaving the ridge behind forever. But fear was not enough to stop him. The voice on the radio had been a warning and a plea. Robert had been here. Robert had known what lay beyond this door, and Harold could not allow his friend's fate to remain buried with the thing beneath the mountain. He retrieved his flashlight and pried open the gap just enough to slip through. The darkness swallowed him whole. The beam of his flashlight carved a thin tunnel of pale light through the stale, frigid air. The smell of old stone enveloped him. He stepped forward cautiously, boots scraping the ancient floor. The corridor extended straight ahead, its walls lined with riveted metal panels. Some had rusted through, revealing thick wires and pipes veined into the structure like arteries. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, echoing through the space. Harold's breath plumed in the beam of the flashlight. The cold deepened the further he went. The silence pressed against his ears with suffocating insistence. It was the kind of silence that suggested the absence of everything living. But the corridor did not feel abandoned. He reached a fork in the passage. To the left lay a corridor choked by collapsed rubble. To the right, another hallway stretched into darkness, its floor marked by the same long, uneven grooves he had seen outside. Whatever had dragged itself through the soil had come this way, too. He followed the prints, heart pounding steadily. His flashlight flickered once. He slapped it instinctively, and the beam steadied, though it had weakened. Batteries drained faster in the cold, he reminded himself. He should conserve it. But the thought of turning off the light filled him with a panic so acute he physically recoiled. He pressed onward, deeper into the hollow mountain. The corridor opened into a wider chamber. The light of his flashlight swept across tarnished metal shelves, rusted tools, and cracked tiles littering the floor. At the center stood a towering cylindrical structure that hummed with a low, steady frequency. Harold felt the vibration through the soles of his boots. This was the heartbeat he had felt outside. The device was dormant in appearance, yet unmistakably alive. A faint blue glow simmered beneath its surface, pulsing like breath. He stepped closer, mesmerized by the subtle movements of light across the cracked casing. Words were printed along the base in faded lettering. He wiped away the grime. Seismic Regulation Node, Unit 3. He recognized the style of the typeface, the same used on government equipment in the early 1980s. But no such nodes were ever built, not according to any record he had seen. This was something else, something buried for a reason. He circled the node slowly, keeping a cautious distance. Behind it, a narrow walkway led to another room. The grooves in the dust continued into it. He followed with dread tightening in his chest. The next chamber was smaller. It felt colder, its walls beaded with frost. In the corner of the room lay a crumpled shape. Harold froze. His flashlight trembled in his hand. The figure was face down, half buried in dust and debris. Its clothing was ragged, the fabric thin, torn by time. The boots were Forest Ranger issue, the old kind, the kind worn 30 years ago. His breath caught painfully in his throat. He moved forward slowly, each movement feeling like a step off a cliff. He knelt beside the body and turned it with gentle hands. The skull stared up at him with empty sockets. The jaw was slightly open, as though caught in the middle of a silent cry. Time had reduced the flesh to fragile remnants, but the uniform, though faded, remained unmistakable. The name Patch, barely clinging to the chest, spelled Nash. Harold's hands shook. He sank to his knees fully, staring at the remains of the man who had once been his closest friend. Robert had not fallen in a ravine. He had not been lost in the woods. He had come here. He had come to the door, entered this place, and died alone in the darkness. Harold reached into his pocket and retrieved the scrap of fabric he had found outside. He laid it gently over Robert's skeletal hand. His pulse hammered in his ears. He felt the weight of guilt and sorrow press heavily on his shoulders. He imagined Robert crawling in the dark, searching for escape, calling out for someone who never came. As Harold bowed his head in grief, the silence broke. A soft scrape echoed from somewhere deeper in the complex. It was not the shifting of stone, not the settling of metal. It was movement. Deliberate, slow, heavy. Harold lifted his flashlight, its beam shaking violently. The scrape came again, closer. Something dragged across the metal floor. Something that moved with the same uneven rhythm as the grooves outside. His breath hitched. He rose unsteadily to his feet and backed toward the entrance of the chamber. The beam of his flashlight flickered again, then steadied. The scrape became a thud. Then another. Then a low, rattling exhale that did not belong to any creature Harold had ever known. He stepped into the corridor, pulse racing. The sound had come from the direction he had not yet explored. A shape shifted in the darkness beyond the beam of light. Something tall, something thin, something wrong in the way it held itself. Too angular, too long in the limbs, too rigid in the spine. Harold's breath stilled. He heard another inhale, the sound unnatural as though pushed through broken lungs. A faint scraping of bone or metal whispered against the walls. The figure remained shrouded in shadow, but he could see the outline of its arm, stretched long and thin, ending in a hand that dragged along the metal floor with a slow, deliberate rhythm. He stepped back, flashlight trembling. The figure stepped forward, its head tilting with an unnatural, jerking motion, as though unused to the concept of movement. The sound it made next chilled Harold more deeply than any cold could. Harold. The voice was not Robert's. Not exactly. It carried the tone of him, the broken remnants of his final words, twisted by decades of isolation and whatever force had shaped them. It was a mimicry of memory, filtered through something that did not understand language, only imitation. Harold turned and ran. His boots thundered against the metal floor. The sound behind him grew, scraping, dragging, the rattle of something ancient and starved, pulling itself down the corridor. He stumbled once, but caught himself, breathing wildly. He reached the main chamber, sprinting past the humming seismic node. The door he had slipped through was ahead, the gap impossibly narrow. He threw himself toward it, twisting sideways to squeeze through. The cold metal tore at his jacket. The door shuddered as something heavy struck it from the other side. He pushed with all his strength. The slab slammed shut with a single thunderous boom. Harold collapsed against the rock, gasping. The fog outside seemed gentle compared to the darkness he had escaped. He scrambled to his feet, grabbed his pack, and staggered toward the plane. He didn't stop to look back, not even once. The forest was no longer a familiar landscape. It had become a corridor of eyes, and breath, and warning. As he climbed into the cockpit and started the engine, he felt the plane tremble under him. Not from mechanical strain, from the earth. A slow, careful vibration spread through the soil beneath the tires, rising up through the airframe. Something inside the mountain was moving again. Something no longer content to remain sealed behind the steel door. The plane lifted off the ground just as a final rumble shook the ridge. The fog parted beneath the wings. Harold ascended through it like a man desperate to outrun his own shadow. He did not look back. He didn't have to. He knew it would not be long before the thing behind the door found a way out. If you want more stories like this, subscribe, watch the next videos, and share this one with others.